Our readers keep telling us that this is the best meatloaf they've made, and honestly, the same is true for us.
Visually, it's just beautiful, it's glowing, and yet so rustic and casual. Balances out that spiciness just perfectly. You can really taste the earthiness from the spices and the thyme.
When unemployment hit 25% and families lost everything, how did they survive? They didn't just make it through America's worst economic disasters. They discovered 30 forgotten meals that kept them alive when hope was gone. From Depression-era stews made with scraps to wartime recipes using no meat, no sugar, and no dairy, these meals saved millions of families. But what were these forgotten dishes that sustained generations through unimaginable hardship? Let's uncover 30 meals that got families through the worst years in America. The Great Depression survivors. Hoover Stew, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, whose administration oversaw the stock market crash, Hoover Stew became the signature meal of the Great Depression. According to the Household Searchlight recipe book from 1931, this wasn't really a recipe. It was a survival strategy born from desperation and mathematical necessity. The basic formula was brutally simple yet infinitely adaptable. Whatever you could find or afford went into one pot. Typically, this meant elbow macaroni as the foundation, canned tomatoes for liquid and vitamins, hot dogs when available for protein, and any vegetables families could scrounge up. Wilted cabbage, aging onions, or even potato peels. But here's what made Hoover Stew remarkable in the economics of survival. It could feed a family of 6 for under 50 cents in 1932 dollars, and the leftovers could stretch for 3 more days with creative additions. Food historians from Eats History note that Hoover Stew variations appeared in soup kitchens nationwide, each region adapting the concept to local ingredients and tastes. In Chicago, Al Capone's infamous soup kitchens served their own version to thousands of hungry Americans daily, often adding whatever meat scraps local butchers couldn't sell. The beauty wasn't in the taste. Families later recalled it as filling but forgettable. It was in the pure mathematics of survival. One pot meant minimal fuel costs, maximum nutrition meant families stayed healthy enough to work, and the ability to feed many people meant no one went to bed hungry. Clara Canucciari, the YouTube sensation who lived through the Depression, remembered her mother making Hoover Stew weekly throughout the 1930s. You put in whatever you had. If there was a little meat, you put it in. If there were potatoes, they went in. Sometimes it was just pasta and water with salt. The goal wasn't to make something fancy. The goal was to make sure everyone got fed and felt like they had a real meal. Mock apple pie. Perhaps no Depression-era recipe better captures the era's desperate creativity and psychological resilience than mock apple pie. According to the Settlement Cookbook, revised through the 1930s, this pie contained 0 apples but somehow delivered the taste, texture, and emotional satisfaction of America's favorite dessert during a time when actual apples cost more than many families earned in a day. The science behind this culinary magic trick is actually fascinating and reveals the sophisticated food chemistry knowledge that housewives developed through necessity. Ritz crackers, which debuted in 1934, specifically marketed to Depression-era families, had the perfect texture to absorb flavors while maintaining structural integrity. When soaked in a carefully calibrated syrup made from sugar, water, and cream of tartar, then seasoned with cinnamon and whatever lemon juice families could afford, the crackers underwent a remarkable transformation that fooled both palate and memory. The preparation required precision that demonstrated how Depression cooking was anything but haphazard. First, the crackers were broken into apple-sized pieces and arranged in pie crust. The syrup was boiled to exactly the right consistency. Too thin, and it wouldn't penetrate the crackers. Too thick, and it would crystallize. The spicing had to be perfect because there was no room for waste or do-overs. When baked, the crackers absorbed the sweet syrup while maintaining enough bite to simulate apple texture, while the cinnamon and lemon provided the familiar flavor notes that triggered positive food memories. Food scientists today explain that our taste buds can be completely tricked by texture and seasoning combinations that trigger sensory memory. Emmy from the Emmy, made in Japan. YouTube channel tested this recipe using Depression-era techniques and couldn't believe how authentically apple-like it tasted. I had to remind myself I wasn't eating apples. The texture was perfect, the sweetness was right, and somehow my brain was convinced this was apple pie. This recipe represents something profound about the Depression era, the absolute refusal to accept defeat or to let circumstances destroy life's small pleasures. When families couldn't afford a 15-cent apple pie, they didn't simply go without dessert. They innovated, adapted, and found ways to create joy and celebration even when everything seemed hopeless. Dandelion Salad. While wealthy Americans were losing fortunes on Wall Street and bread lines stretched around city blocks, poor families discovered that salvation literally grew as weeds in their yards. According to The Joy of Cooking from 1931, dandelion greens became a crucial source of free nutrition during the Depression's darkest years, providing vitamins that many families couldn't afford to purchase. Dandelions weren't just free, they were nutritional powerhouses that often provided better nutrition than expensive store-bought vegetables. These humble weeds contained more vitamin A than carrots, more iron than spinach, more calcium than broccoli, and more potassium than bananas. Families would gather the young leaves in early spring when they were tender and less bitter, creating salads that cost absolutely nothing but provided essential vitamins that prevented scurvy, night blindness, and other nutrition deficiency diseases that plagued Depression-era families. The foraging process became a family activity that connected urban families to survival skills their rural grandparents had known, but city life had forgotten. Children learned to identify the best picking spots, areas away from roads and animal waste, and the optimal picking times when leaves were most tender. The best dandelion greens came from plants that hadn't yet flowered, picked in early morning when they were crisp and full of moisture. The typical preparation was deceptively simple, but required knowledge passed down through families. Wash the leaves thoroughly in multiple changes of water to remove grit and insects. Dry them carefully to prevent wilting, then dress with whatever vinegar and oil were available. When possible, families added sliced radishes for crunch, hard-boiled eggs for protein, or even wild onions foraged from the same areas. The result was a salad that provided essential nutrition while costing literally nothing. Food historians note that dandelion salad often served as both the vegetable course and the main course for families with no other options, particularly in early spring when stored winter foods were exhausted, but gardens hadn't yet produced anything edible. What's remarkable is how this forced foraging connected families to the land and to survival skills that had sustained humanity for millennia, skills that urbanization had nearly eliminated but economic necessity quickly restored. Water pie. Perhaps no recipe better captures the absolute desperation and remarkable ingenuity of the Depression than water pie, a dessert so impossible it sounds like a joke, yet so crucial to family morale that it appeared in dozens of community cookbooks throughout the 1930s. According to Martha Stewart's historical research, this pie emerged during the covered wagon era, but reached peak popularity when families literally had nothing left to cook with except the most basic pantry staples. The ingredients sound absolutely impossible: water, flour, butter or lard, sugar, and vanilla extract. That's it. No eggs, no milk, no cream, no fruit. Just the most fundamental baking ingredients transformed through technique and desperation into something that somehow resembled custard pie and provided both calories and psychological comfort. The magic happened in the careful preparation and baking process, where chemistry and hope combined to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The flour was whisked with cold water to prevent lumps, then heated slowly while stirring constantly until it thickened into a custard-like consistency. Sugar and vanilla were added for sweetness and flavor, while a small amount of butter provided richness that made the filling feel more substantial than it was. When poured into a pie crust and baked slowly, the filling set into something that looked, felt, and surprisingly tasted like a real custard pie. Recipe books from the era show dozens of variations that demonstrate how families adapted this basic concept to whatever they had available. Some families added a tablespoon of vinegar for tang that mimicked lemon. Others used what little lemon juice they could find. The crust was often made with lard instead of butter, and even the sugar could be substituted with corn syrup, molasses, or maple syrup, if that's what was available. Some versions included a pinch of salt to enhance the sweet flavors, while others added extra vanilla or even ground cinnamon for complexity. What made water pie truly remarkable wasn't its taste. Family accounts describe it as sweet and comforting but not fancy. It was its profound psychological impact. In a time when families were losing their homes, their jobs, and their hope, the simple act of making a pie restored some sense of normalcy and celebration. It said that even in the depths of economic collapse, there was still room for sweetness, for dessert, for the small ceremonies that made life worth living. Poor man's meal, made famous decades later by Clara Canucciari on her Great Depression cooking YouTube channel, Poor Man's Meal represents the absolute essence of Depression-era cooking philosophy: maximum nutrition, minimum cost, zero waste, and the transformation of humble ingredients into something that felt like a real meal rather than just survival food. The recipe couldn't be simpler in concept, but required skill and timing to execute properly. Slice potatoes into rounds, fry them in whatever fat was available until half-cooked and starting to brown, add sliced onions for sweetness and nutrition, then throw in sliced hot dogs for protein and salt. Cook everything together until the potatoes were golden brown and tender, the onions were caramelized, and the hot dogs were heated through and slightly crispy. The total cost in 1932 would have been around 25 cents and could feed a family of 4 with enough leftovers for the next day's lunch. But Clara's commentary revealed the deeper truth about this meal that made it psychologically crucial for families facing economic devastation. You want to know about the Depression? I quit high school because I couldn't afford socks. Couldn't afford anything to wear, but we survived. This meal, it wasn't fancy, but it was hot. It filled you up, and it made you feel like you were eating real food, not just scraps. Poor man's meal wasn't just sustenance. It was proof that families could maintain dignity, nutrition, and satisfaction even when the world seemed to be ending around them. The nutritional profile was actually quite sophisticated for such a simple dish. Potatoes provided complex carbohydrates for energy, B vitamins, vitamin C, and potassium, essential nutrients that prevented many deficiency diseases. Onions added vitamin C, folate, and sulfur compounds that supported immune function. Hot dogs, while processed, provided protein, fat, and sodium that hard-working bodies needed to maintain strength and health. The cooking technique was crucial to the meal's success and satisfaction. The potatoes had to be sliced thin enough to cook through, but thick enough to maintain structure. The fat, whether lard, bacon grease, or precious butter, had to be hot enough to create browning, but not so hot that it burned. The onions were added at exactly the right time to caramelize without burning, creating natural sweetness that balanced the salt from the hot dogs. Most importantly, Poorman's meal was hot, substantial, and familiar, 3 qualities that provided psychological comfort when comfort was desperately scarce. It looked like a real dinner, smelled like home cooking, and provided the satisfaction that kept families going through impossibly difficult times. Depression cake, also known as wacky cake, war cake, or crazy cake, depression cake achieved what seemed impossible: a moist, delicious chocolate cake made without eggs, butter, or milk, three ingredients that had become luxury items beyond the reach of most families during the economic collapse. According to the Woman's Home Companion magazine from 1918, this recipe had its origins in World War I rationing, but reached peak popularity and perfection during the 1930s when economic necessity forced innovation. The secret to depression cake lay in understanding basic food chemistry and applying it creatively when traditional ingredients weren't available. Vinegar and baking soda created the acid-base reaction needed for the cake to rise without eggs. When these ingredients combined, they produced carbon dioxide bubbles that gave the cake lift and texture. Vegetable oil replaced butter, providing moisture and richness while being more affordable and shelf-stable. Water or coffee replaced milk, with coffee adding depth to the chocolate flavor while masking any unusual tastes from the ingredient substitutions. The mixing method was crucial and differed significantly from traditional cake-making techniques. All dry ingredients were combined in the baking pan itself. Then wells were made in the mixture where wet ingredients were added. This one-bowl method wasn't just convenient. It was essential for proper chemical reactions. The vinegar and baking soda had to be kept separate until the final mixing to ensure maximum leavening power, and the minimal mixing prevented the development of gluten that could make the cake tough. Food chemists today understand exactly why this worked so well. The acid in vinegar reacting with the alkaline baking soda created immediate leavening power, while the oil provided fat molecules that created tender texture. The coffee, when used, added complexity to the chocolate flavor, while contributing liquid for proper hydration. The result was a cake that not only tasted good, but actually stayed moist longer than traditional cakes, a crucial advantage when food needed to last, and families couldn't afford to waste anything. What's most remarkable about depression cake is that many families preferred it to the expensive versions they'd made before the economic crash. Children who grew up eating this cake remembered it fondly as the best chocolate cake ever, not knowing that it was born from poverty rather than choice. It proved that economic necessity could spark culinary innovation that was actually superior to what money could buy, and that creativity and knowledge could triumph over scarcity. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Universally known by its military nickname SOS, which stood for something we can't say in polite company, creamed chipped beef on toast became a staple in both Depression-era homes and military mess halls around the world. According to Chowhound's historical food research, this dish gained popularity because dried chipped beef had an incredibly long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could provide substantial protein to feed a family cheaply when fresh meat was completely out of reach. The preparation was straightforward, but required technique to avoid a gluey, unpalatable mess. Make a white sauce by melting butter or lard in a pan, whisking in flour to create a roux, then gradually adding milk while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The dried chipped beef was then added to the hot white sauce, where it rehydrated and flavored the entire mixture with its concentrated, salty taste. The final product was served over toast, which provided carbohydrates and helped stretch the protein to feed more people. Chipped beef itself was a marvel of food preservation technology that had sustained armies and frontier families for generations. The beef was salted heavily, then dried and pressed into thin, jerky-like sheets that could last for months without spoiling. When rehydrated in the creamy sauce, it regained much of its original texture while contributing intense beefy flavor that made the simple white sauce taste rich and satisfying. What made this meal crucial during the Depression was its incredible efficiency. in providing nutrition and satisfaction from minimal, affordable ingredients. A small jar of chipped beef could be stretched to feed an entire family when combined with the filling white sauce and bread. The saltiness of the beef made the meal satisfying in ways that many bland Depression-era foods weren't, while the creamy sauce provided calories and psychological comfort that helped families feel they were eating real food rather than just sustenance. Military history shows that this dish sustained soldiers through both world wars and countless other conflicts, proving its effectiveness as survival food that could maintain morale and nutrition under the most challenging circumstances. Soldiers complained about it constantly, but they also credited it with keeping them fed and functional when nothing else was available. The psychological impact was significant. Despite its humble ingredients and military associations, creamed chipped beef on toast felt like a complete, substantial meal that satisfied both hunger and the need for familiar comfort food during uncertain times. Navy bean soup. According to Mildred Lewis from Temple, Texas, whose recipe appeared in Taste of Home magazine and represented generations of family knowledge, beans were a commodity you did not survive without in the 30s. Navy bean soup represented one of the most nutritionally complete, economical, and psychologically satisfying meals of the Depression era, providing protein, fiber, vitamins, and the kind of stick-to-your-ribs satisfaction that helped families maintain strength and morale through the hardest times. Dried navy beans were perfect Depression food. They were incredibly cheap when bought in bulk, stored for months without spoiling, expanded dramatically when cooked to feed many people, and when combined with even small amounts of meat, created nutritionally complete meals that could sustain hard-working families. A pound of dried beans, costing perhaps 10 cents, could feed a family of 6 for 2 days when prepared properly. The cooking process was both simple and sophisticated, requiring patience and technique that Depression-era cooks mastered through necessity. Beans were soaked overnight to soften and reduce cooking time, then simmered slowly with whatever meat was available, a ham bone with scraps of meat still attached, bacon ends, or even just a piece of salt pork for flavoring. Onions and celery were added when available, providing vitamins and flavor complexity that transformed simple beans into something that tasted intentional rather than desperate. The slow cooking process was crucial for both nutrition and taste. As the beans simmered for hours, they released starches that naturally thickened the soup into a creamy, satisfying consistency without requiring expensive cream or butter. The meat, cooked until it fell apart, distributed its flavor throughout the pot while providing essential amino acids that combined with the beans to create complete protein equivalent to expensive meat dishes. Food historians note that navy bean soup often served as the foundation for other meals throughout the week, demonstrating the sophisticated meal planning that Depression-era families developed. Leftover soup could be thickened with flour or breadcrumbs to create a bean dip for crackers, thinned with water or broth to stretch into more servings, or used as a base for other vegetables that needed to be used before spoiling. The psychological comfort provided by navy bean soup was enormous. It was hot, filling, aromatic, and felt substantial in ways that many Depression meals didn't. Families remembered the smell of bean soup cooking all day as a sign that dinner would be satisfying and that there would be enough for everyone. Cornbread and milk. This combination sounds almost too simple to be considered a meal. But for millions of Depression-era families, cornbread crumbled into a glass of milk represented both practical nutrition and profound comfort, a meal that connected them to rural traditions while providing essential nutrients that kept families healthy during the worst economic crisis in American history. According to Survival Mom's historical research, this meal provided essential carbohydrates, protein, calcium, and B vitamins for families who had few other nutritional options. Cornmeal was significantly cheaper than wheat flour and could be purchased in large quantities that lasted for months when stored properly. The cornbread itself was often made with just cornmeal, water, salt, and a little lard or bacon grease for flavor and fat. No eggs, no milk, no sugar, just the absolute basics transformed through technique into something satisfying and nourishing. When crumbled into milk, often buttermilk, which local creameries frequently gave away free because it was a byproduct of butter making, it created a filling, nutritious meal that provided both immediate satisfaction and lasting energy. The appeal went far beyond simple economics and nutrition. Cornbread and milk connected families to their rural roots and simpler times when life was hard but predictable. For children especially, the sweet milk softening the slightly coarse cornbread created a comfort food that made poverty feel less harsh and provided sensory memories of security and plenty, even during times of scarcity. The preparation became a ritual that provided structure and comfort during chaotic times. Children would crumble their cornbread into patterns in their milk glasses, creating games and entertainment from simple ingredients. Parents could stretch the milk by adding water, and the cornbread could be made more filling by adding whatever vegetables or leftover meat were available. Nutritionally, this combination was surprisingly sophisticated and complete. Cornmeal provided complex carbohydrates for sustained energy, B vitamins that prevented pellagra and other deficiency diseases, and fiber that aided digestion. Milk delivered complete protein, calcium for strong bones and teeth, and fat that growing children and hard-working adults needed to maintain health and energy. The combination provided nearly all essential nutrients except vitamin C, which families obtained from whatever fruits or vegetables they could afford or forage. Many Depression-era children remembered cornbread and milk as their favorite meal, not understanding until adulthood that it was born from poverty rather than choice. This speaks to the skill of Depression-era parents in creating positive food experiences that maintained family morale and children's sense of security, even during the most challenging circumstances. Mulligan Stew. Also known as hobo stew, Mulligan Stew represented the ultimate expression of Depression-era resourcefulness and community spirit, a meal created by homeless individuals who combined whatever ingredients they could find, beg, borrow, or forage into communal pots that ensured everyone ate something, even those who had absolutely nothing to contribute. According to historical research from the North Star, this was literal survival food that sustained thousands of displaced Americans during the worst years of economic collapse. The name comes from the golf term mulligan, a do-over shot, because the stew was essentially whatever ingredients got a second chance at being useful. Typical ingredients might include potatoes rescued from restaurant garbage, carrots too old for store sale, onions with soft spots cut away, any available meat scraps from butcher shops, and whatever vegetables could be found, foraged, or obtained through the informal networks that sustained homeless communities. What made Mulligan Stew remarkable wasn't its consistency. Every pot was completely different depending on what was available, but its profound community aspect and the sophisticated sharing systems that developed around it. Groups of homeless individuals would gather in hobo jungles or other temporary camps, and each person would contribute whatever they had to a communal pot. Those with nothing to contribute were still fed, creating survival networks based on mutual aid rather than individual accumulation. The cooking process required skill and knowledge that many participants had learned during better times or acquired through necessity. Someone needed to understand how to build and maintain cooking fires using whatever fuel was available. Others knew how to clean and prepare vegetables that were past their prime, how to identify edible wild plants to add to the pot, and how to season and cook the mixture to create something palatable rather than just edible. The stew was typically cooked in large metal containers, anything from proper pots to cleaned tin cans or even makeshift vessels created from found materials. The cooking process was slow and communal, with participants taking turns stirring, adding ingredients as they became available, and sharing knowledge about cooking techniques and food safety. Mulligan Stew represents the absolute rock bottom of American economic hardship, yet it also demonstrates the remarkable human capacity for cooperation, sharing, and survival in the face of impossible circumstances. It proved that even when individual resources were completely exhausted, communities could still find ways to ensure that everyone had something to eat and that dignity could be maintained even in the most desperate situations. 2. Rationing recipes. Victory Meatloaf. When meat became so strictly rationed that families received only 64 red stamps per month for all meat purchases, barely enough for 1 pound of ground beef per week for an entire family, traditional meatloaf became impossible for most households. According to Eats History's research on wartime cooking, Victory Meatloaf solved this crisis by stretching small amounts of ground meat with breadcrumbs, vegetables, and creative substitutions that often created more flavorful and nutritious results than peacetime recipes. The typical Victory Meatloaf recipe used only half a pound of ground beef for an entire family-sized loaf that needed to feed 6 to 8 people. The rest of the bulk came from ingredients that weren't rationed: breadcrumbs made from stale bread, grated vegetables like carrots and onions that added moisture and vitamins, oatmeal or cooked rice for binding and substance, and sometimes even mashed potatoes left over from previous meals. Worcestershire sauce, herbs, and careful seasoning provided flavor that made the extended meat taste more substantial and satisfying than its quantity suggested. Government-issued cookbooks and home economics programs actively promoted these meat extenders, teaching homemakers how to maintain family nutrition and satisfaction while working within strict rationing constraints. The Office of Price Administration published detailed guides showing how to combine rationed and non-rationed ingredients to create meals that felt normal and abundant despite wartime shortages. The preparation required technique and understanding that homemakers developed through practice and shared knowledge. The vegetables had to be grated finely enough to distribute evenly, but not so fine that they created mushiness. The breadcrumbs needed to be the right texture to absorb moisture without making the loaf soggy. The binding had to be perfect, because there was no room for waste if a loaf fell apart during cooking. What's remarkable about Victory Meatloaf is that many families preferred these wartime versions to their peacetime recipes. The vegetables made the meatloaf lighter, more moist, and more digestible, while the extended cooking time allowed flavors to meld and develop in ways that pure meat couldn't achieve. Children who grew up during the war often requested the special meatloaf long after rationing ended, not understanding that their favorite dish was born from scarcity rather than choice. The psychological impact was enormous for families struggling to maintain normalcy during wartime. Victory Meatloaf looked like the meatloaf they remembered from before the war, smelled like comfort food, and provided the satisfaction of a substantial dinner that helped maintain morale and family traditions despite the extraordinary circumstances. Eggless chocolate cake. With eggs severely rationed and often completely unavailable to civilian families, most of America's egg production was being shipped to feed troops overseas. Wartime bakers had to completely reinvent dessert making using ingredients that weren't controlled by the rationing system. According to the 1940s experiment, which recreates authentic wartime recipes using period-accurate techniques and ingredients, eggless chocolate cake became both a symbol of home front ingenuity and proof that necessity could create superior results. The secret to successful eggless cake lay in understanding the multiple roles that eggs play in baking and finding creative substitutions for each function. Eggs provide moisture, binding, leavening, and richness, all crucial for successful cake texture. Wartime bakers discovered that applesauce or mashed bananas could provide moisture and some binding, while vinegar and baking soda created the chemical leavening needed for the cake to rise properly. Vegetable oil replaced butter for richness and moisture, while careful attention to mixing techniques prevented the dense, heavy texture that could result from improper preparation. Some recipes achieved remarkable results using mayonnaise as an egg substitute. Mayonnaise contained oil and vinegar, providing both fat and acid needed for proper texture, while its emulsified structure helped create the smooth batter texture that eggs normally provided. Other bakers discovered that applesauce not only replaced eggs effectively, but actually created moisture, more tender cakes that stayed fresh longer than traditional recipes. The results often surprised families with their superiority to peacetime cakes. The fruit-based moisture made these cakes incredibly tender and helped them stay fresh for days rather than hours. Crucial when sugar rationing meant desserts had to be savored slowly and nothing could be wasted. The absence of eggs also meant the cakes were less likely to become dry or rubbery if slightly overbaked, making them more forgiving for busy homemakers juggling wartime responsibilities. Government nutritionists encouraged these substitutions not just for rationing compliance, but for improved nutrition. The fruit additions provided vitamins that pure cake couldn't deliver, making dessert into a more nutritionally complete experience. Children were getting vitamin C from applesauce and potassium from bananas, along with their sweet treat, turning what had been empty calories into food that actually contributed to wartime nutrition needs. The psychological impact of maintaining dessert traditions during wartime cannot be overstated. Families needed celebration, sweetness, and normal pleasures to maintain morale during years of sacrifice and uncertainty. Eggless chocolate cake proved that even the most challenging rationing restrictions couldn't eliminate life's small joys. They could only inspire new ways to create them. Cheese and potato dumplings. According to the George C. Marshall Foundation's research on wartime cooking, cheese and potato dumplings represented one of the most successful meatless main dishes of the rationing era, providing complete protein while using ingredients that were readily available even under strict rationing constraints. This recipe solved the crucial wartime challenge of creating satisfying, substantial meals without meat, while maintaining the nutrition that families needed to support the war effort through their work and daily activities. The process was labor-intensive, but used simple techniques that most homemakers could master. Peel and boil potatoes until tender, then mash them thoroughly without adding milk or butter, both strictly rationed. Reconstituted dried eggs were added if available, along with grated cheese, usually whatever variety could be obtained with rationing points. The mixture was seasoned with salt, pepper, and herbs like thyme if available, then formed into dumplings and rolled in additional grated cheese before baking until golden and crusty on the outside. What made this dish nutritionally brilliant was the principle of protein combining that nutritionists were just beginning to understand. Potatoes provided essential amino acids that complemented those found in cheese, creating a complete protein profile comparable to meat when consumed together. The absence of milk and butter, while initially disappointing to cooks accustomed to richer preparations, actually made the dish lighter and easier to digest while highlighting the natural flavors of the potatoes and cheese. The cooking technique was crucial for success. The potatoes had to be completely dry after boiling to prevent soggy dumplings, the cheese had to be grated finely enough to distribute evenly, and the baking temperature had to be high enough to create the crispy exterior that made the dumplings appealing and substantial. Wartime cooks learned to test doneness by checking that the dumplings held their shape when moved and had developed a golden brown crust. Wartime families often served these dumplings with whatever vegetables they could grow in their victory gardens or obtain through rationing, creating complete meals that satisfied both nutritional needs and psychological desires for substantial, satisfying dinners. A typical meal might include the dumplings alongside steamed carrots, boiled cabbage, or canned green beans, with perhaps a small portion of preserved fruit for dessert. The recipe became so popular that many families continued making it after the war ended, discovering that they preferred the lighter, more flavorful wartime version to their pre-war cooking. Children who grew up eating these dumplings often requested them as adults, creating family traditions that outlasted the wartime necessity that created them. Lord Woolton Pie. Named after Britain's Minister of Food, Lord Woolton Pie became famous throughout the English-speaking world as a meatless main course that somehow managed to feel substantial, satisfying, and worthy of a place at the dinner table during a time when traditional meat-based meals were impossible for most families. According to Food in World War II historical research, this pie used only vegetables that were available during wartime rationing, yet through careful preparation and technique, created something that felt like a complete celebratory meal rather than just sustenance. The filling consisted entirely of root vegetables that could be grown in home gardens or purchased without rationing points: potatoes for substance and starch, carrots for sweetness and color, parsnips for complexity and mild spice, turnips for texture and slight bitterness that balanced the other flavors, and whatever other vegetables were available seasonally. All vegetables were diced uniformly to ensure even cooking, then seasoned with whatever herbs could be grown or obtained, typically thyme, parsley, or sage. The genius of Lord Woolton Pie lay in its preparation technique, which transformed simple vegetables into something rich and satisfying. The vegetables were cooked slowly until they released their natural starches and sugars, creating a thick, gravy-like sauce that bound everything together without requiring butter, cream, or other rationed ingredients. The resulting filling had the consistency and richness of a traditional meat pie, while providing complex flavors that satisfied in ways that simple boiled vegetables never could. The pastry crust presented its own challenges during rationing, when both butter and lard were strictly controlled. Wartime bakers learned to create acceptable crusts using whatever fats were available. Often a combination of margarine, vegetable shortening, or even grated sweet when it could be obtained. The crust was typically thicker and more substantial than peacetime versions, providing additional calories and the psychological satisfaction of eating real pie rather than just vegetables. American families quickly adapted this recipe using their own available vegetables and techniques. Sweet potatoes might replace parsnips in the South, while Midwestern families added corn or green beans from their victory gardens. The principle remained constant: transform ordinary vegetables into something special through careful preparation and presentation. The psychological impact of Lord Woolton Pie was enormous for families struggling to maintain normal meal patterns during wartime. It looked like a proper dinner centerpiece, required skill and time to prepare, making it feel special, and provided the satisfaction of eating something substantial and carefully made, rather than just thrown together from whatever was available. Vinegar Pie. When lemons became completely impossible to find in civilian markets and sugar was rationed to tiny amounts that had to last for weeks, American bakers created one of the most unusual and surprisingly successful desserts in culinary history: vinegar pie. According to So Yummy's research on Great Depression and wartime foods, this pie used apple cider vinegar to provide the tart, bright flavor that made desserts interesting and satisfying without requiring expensive citrus or large amounts of precious sugar. The recipe required precise balance and technique to transform what could have been an inedible disaster into something remarkably similar to lemon meringue pie. The filling combined apple cider vinegar with water, a carefully measured amount of precious sugar, and flour to create a custard-like texture that set properly when baked. Spices like cinnamon and nutmeg were crucial. They masked any harsh vinegar notes while adding warmth and complexity that made the pie feel intentional rather than desperate. The chemistry behind vinegar pie was actually sophisticated, requiring understanding of how acids interact with starches and sugars to create palatable desserts. The vinegar provided the tartness that made the limited sugar taste more intense and satisfying, while the flour created structure that gave the filling proper custard texture. The spices weren't just flavor additions, they were essential for creating a dessert that children would eat willingly and adults would find satisfying. Preparation required careful attention to prevent the vinegar from overwhelming the other flavors. The liquid ingredients were heated slowly, with constant stirring, to prevent the flour from lumping and to allow the flavors to meld gradually. The sugar was dissolved completely before adding other ingredients, and the mixture was strained to ensure smoothness. When poured into a pre-baked pie crust and baked at moderate temperature, the result was a pie that looked and tasted remarkably similar to the lemon desserts that families remembered from better times. What made vinegar pie remarkable beyond its unusual ingredients was its superior keeping quality compared to cream or custard pies. The acid in the vinegar actually helped preserve the pie, allowing it to sit at room temperature for days without spoiling, crucial when refrigeration was unreliable and families needed desserts to last through multiple meals. This preservation quality made it perfect for special occasions when families wanted celebration foods that could be enjoyed over several days. The psychological impact was enormous for families struggling to maintain normal celebrations and traditions during wartime. Having any dessert at all represented luxury and normalcy, while the familiar pie format connected families to peacetime traditions even when the ingredients were completely different. Spam and bean casserole. Spam, introduced by Hormel in 1937 and perfected just in time for World War II, became an absolute wartime staple because it provided substantial protein without requiring refrigeration, used fewer rationing points than fresh meat, and could be stored for months without spoiling. According to Homestead How-To's research on depression and wartime recipes, combining Spam with beans created one of the most nutritionally complete, economical, and psychologically satisfying meals of the rationing era. The typical preparation was deceptively simple, but required technique to create something appealing rather than just edible. Spam was sliced into uniform pieces and arranged in a casserole dish, then covered with baked beans that were often made from scratch, using dried beans soaked overnight and slow-cooked with molasses, onions, and whatever seasonings were available. Some families added vegetables from their victory gardens, carrots, onions, or green beans, creating more complex flavors and additional nutrition. This combination was nutritionally brilliant, providing complete protein from both the meat and bean sources, complex carbohydrates for sustained energy, and enough calories to sustain people doing hard physical work to support the war effort. The saltiness of Spam perfectly balanced the sweetness of molasses-based baked beans, creating flavor combinations that satisfied in ways that many wartime meals couldn't achieve. The dish was also incredibly filling, helping families feel satisfied even when portion sizes were smaller than peacetime meals. What made Spam and bean casserole particularly valuable during wartime was its exceptional keeping quality and versatility. The casserole could be reheated multiple times without losing flavor or texture, stretched with additional beans or vegetables when unexpected guests arrived, and even eaten cold when fuel for cooking was scarce or unavailable. Leftovers could be mashed and formed into patties for frying, mixed with eggs for breakfast scrambles, or used as filling for sandwiches. The preparation process became a family activity that helped maintain morale during difficult times. Children could help layer ingredients, older family members could share cooking techniques, and the long baking time filled the house with appealing aromas that created anticipation and comfort. The substantial appearance of the finished casserole, a large dish that could feed many people, provided psychological satisfaction during times when abundance was just a memory. Many families discovered that they actually preferred this wartime combination to the expensive meat dishes they'd enjoyed before rationing. The beans added fiber and complex flavors that pure meat dishes lacked, while the Spam provided consistent flavor and texture that was often superior to the variable quality of fresh meat available during wartime shortages. Carrot cookies. When sugar was rationed to tiny amounts and butter became nearly impossible for civilian families to obtain, wartime bakers discovered that carrots could provide both natural sweetness and moisture for cookies that children would eat eagerly and adults would find satisfying. According to the 1940s Experiment's recreated recipes, carrot cookies became wildly popular because they used vegetables that families could grow themselves in victory gardens, creating sweet treats that didn't require precious rationing points. The preparation process was more complex than peacetime cookie recipes, but used techniques that most homemakers could master with practice. Fresh carrots were cooked until tender, then mashed or grated finely to create a smooth puree that would distribute evenly throughout the cookie dough. This carrot base was combined with minimal flour, also rationed but more available than sugar, whatever fat could be obtained, often a combination of margarine and vegetable oil, and small amounts of precious sugar or honey that were stretched much further by the natural sweetness of the carrots. Spices were crucial for transforming what could have been vegetable-flavored cookies into genuine treats that children would request. Cinnamon was most common, providing warmth and familiar sweet spice flavors that made the cookies taste intentional rather than substituted. Nutmeg, when available, added complexity, while vanilla extract, when families could afford it, enhanced the sweet flavors and masked any vegetable tastes that might seem unusual to young palates. The baking technique required careful attention to prevent the high moisture content from creating soggy or heavy cookies. The dough was often chilled before shaping to make handling easier, and baking temperatures were adjusted to ensure proper texture. The finished cookies were soft, chewy, and naturally sweet, with an appealing orange color that made them visually appealing even when other ingredients were plain. The nutritional benefits were remarkable and intentional. These cookies provided vitamin A essential for vision and immune function, fiber that aided digestion, and natural sugars that provided energy without the empty calories of pure sugar cookies. Children were getting genuine nutrition along with their sweet treats, making dessert into a more complete part of wartime meal planning. Many families found that children actually preferred these carrot cookies to traditional recipes, not understanding that their favorite treats were born from wartime necessity. The cookies kept well in sealed containers, making them perfect for packed lunches, after-school snacks, and special occasions when families wanted celebration foods that felt abundant rather than rationed. Oatmeal bread. When wheat flour became strictly rationed and often completely unavailable to civilian families, most wheat production was being shipped overseas to feed Allied troops. Wartime bakers learned to extend their precious flour supplies by adding oats, creating bread that was actually denser, more nutritious, and more satisfying than traditional white bread. According to rationing-era recipe collections and government-issued cooking guides, oatmeal bread became a staple that many families preferred to their peacetime baking. The process required understanding how different grains behaved in bread making and adjusting techniques accordingly. Oats were usually ground into coarse flour using whatever equipment was available: coffee grinders, food mills, or even mortar and pestle for families with no other options. This oat flour was combined with whatever wheat flour could be obtained through rationing, creating dough that had different texture and rising properties than pure wheat bread. The oats created heartier, denser bread that was more filling per slice than white bread, helping families feel satisfied with smaller portions when food was scarce. The texture was more complex and interesting, with slight nuttiness from the oats that many families found more appealing than the bland white bread they'd eaten before the war. The bread also stayed fresh longer than pure wheat bread, crucial when families couldn't waste any food and needed baked goods to last for several days. Nutritionally, oatmeal bread was significantly superior to white bread, providing fiber that aided digestion, B vitamins that prevented deficiency diseases, and protein that helped families maintain strength and health during stressful wartime conditions. The complex carbohydrates from oats provided sustained energy that helped people working long hours in factories and other war support jobs maintain their stamina throughout demanding days. The bread-making process became a weekly ritual that provided structure and normalcy during uncertain times. The long rising periods required patience and planning that gave families something positive to focus on, while the aroma of baking bread filled homes with comforting scents that created psychological warmth and security. Children learned bread-making skills that connected them to traditional food knowledge while adapting to wartime realities. Many families discovered that oatmeal bread made superior toast, French toast, and bread pudding compared to white bread. The oats created interesting textures and flavors that enhanced these simple preparations, turning basic ingredients into more satisfying and appealing meals that helped maintain family morale during difficult times. Victory Garden Soup. According to Saber-Tooth Tiger's research on wartime cooking, Victory Garden Soup represented the ultimate expression of home front self-sufficiency and patriotic contribution to the war effort. In 1943, over 20 million Victory Gardens were producing one-third of all American produce. And this soup used whatever vegetables families could grow themselves, creating nutritious meals that didn't require any rationing points, while demonstrating independence from government food distribution systems. The soup's base was typically water or vegetable broth made from scraps and trimmings that would otherwise be discarded. Potato peels, carrot tops, onion skins, and celery leaves were simmered to extract maximum nutrition and flavor from every part of homegrown vegetables. This waste-free approach was both economically necessary and patriotically important, as families were encouraged to minimize food waste to support the war effort. The vegetable combinations changed seasonally, creating soups that reflected the natural cycles of garden production and teaching families to eat in harmony with local growing seasons. Spring versions might feature fresh peas, early lettuce, and tender greens, providing vitamin C and fresh flavors after months of stored winter foods. Summer soups showcased tomatoes, beans, squash, and corn, creating hearty meals that captured peak growing season abundance. Fall versions highlighted root vegetables, late harvest greens, and preserved vegetables that would sustain families through winter months. What made Victory Garden Soup psychologically powerful was its connection to the larger war effort and national purpose. Families weren't just feeding themselves, they were participating in national defense through their gardens and their cooking. Every bowl of soup represented independence from rationing systems, contribution to food security, and proof that families could take care of themselves while supporting their country through crisis. The preparation process was often communal, with family members sharing garden work, food preparation, and cooking responsibilities. Children learned to identify vegetables, understand seasonal growing patterns, and develop cooking skills that connected them to food production rather than just consumption. Grandparents shared traditional knowledge about food preservation, cooking techniques, and garden management that bridged generations and preserved important skills. The soup was often the centerpiece of family meals, served with homemade bread and whatever other foods could be obtained through rationing or home production. The substantial nature of vegetable-based soup When properly prepared with adequate fats and seasonings, provided satisfying meals that helped families maintain nutrition and morale during years of scarcity and uncertainty. Potato candy. When sugar was rationed to as little as 8 ounces per person per week, barely enough for basic cooking, much less candy making, wartime families with children faced the heartbreaking reality that sweet treats had become impossible luxuries. According to wartime recipe collections and government home economics publications, potato candy emerged as a brilliant solution that used ingredients available without rationing points to create genuine candy that satisfied children's cravings while providing actual nutrition. The process seemed almost magical to families encountering it for the first time. Cooked potatoes were mashed until completely smooth, then powdered sugar was gradually added until a workable dough formed. The amount of sugar required was dramatically less than traditional candy recipes because the potatoes provided bulk, moisture, and natural binding that allowed small amounts of sweetener to create candy-like texture and taste. The mixture was then rolled thin and spread with peanut butter, when available, or other fillings before being cut into squares or rolled into logs. The science behind this transformation fascinated both home cooks and food scientists. Potatoes provided starches that bound with sugar to create proper candy texture, while their natural moisture eliminated the need for additional liquids that would normally be required in candy making. The mild flavor of potatoes completely disappeared in the finished product, leaving only sweetness and whatever flavoring was added. The starch content also helped preserve the candy, making it last longer than traditional sweets. Preparation techniques were crucial for success and required skills that families developed through practice and shared knowledge. The potatoes had to be cooked until completely tender, then mashed, while still warm, to prevent lumps that would create unpleasant texture. The sugar was added gradually while mixing constantly to prevent crystallization that would make the candy grainy or bitter. The finished dough needed to rest briefly to allow moisture to distribute evenly before shaping and cutting. For children especially, potato candy provided the sweetness they craved while delivering nutrition that pure sugar couldn't match. Potatoes contributed vitamin C, potassium, and complex carbohydrates, while peanut butter fillings added protein and healthy fats. Parents could feel good about giving children treats that actually contributed to their nutrition rather than just providing empty calories. The candy became a special treat for birthdays, holidays, and other celebrations when families wanted to maintain normal traditions despite wartime restrictions. Children often preferred homemade potato candy to store-bought sweets they remembered from before the war, creating positive associations with wartime cooking that lasted long after rationing ended. Modern crisis meals. Government cheese casserole. During the devastating economic crisis of the 1970s, when inflation reached 14% and unemployment soared above 10%, the federal government began distributing surplus cheese to low-income families. According to Economic Research Service data, food prices became so volatile that families never knew what groceries would cost from week to week, making this free government cheese a crucial protein source for millions of struggling American families. Government cheese was distinctly different from commercial varieties. Highly processed, came in large blocks, had incredible shelf life, and possessed unique texture and flavor that families had to learn to work with creatively. The cheese was dense, salty, and melted differently than regular cheese, requiring specific techniques to transform it into appealing meals. Families developed sophisticated methods for creating satisfying casseroles using this free cheese as the foundation. The typical preparation involved slowly melting the government cheese with whatever milk was available, often stretched with water when dairy was too expensive. The cooking process required patience to prevent the processed cheese from becoming rubbery. Families learned to melt the cheese slowly over low heat, stirring constantly and adding liquid gradually. Seasonings like garlic powder or hot sauce helped mask the artificial flavor while creating appealing taste profiles that children would accept willingly. What made government cheese casserole psychologically important went beyond nutrition. It provided abundance and security when food costs were spiraling beyond control. Having a large casserole that could provide multiple meals gave families a sense of plenty and control, even when everything else seemed chaotic. Hamburger Helper Homemade. When boxed, Hamburger Helper became too expensive during the severe inflation crisis of the 1970s. Food prices were rising so rapidly that grocery bills could increase 20% from one shopping trip to the next. Creative home cooks began reverse engineering the concept using basic pantry ingredients, creating homemade versions that cost a fraction of commercial products while often delivering superior flavor. According to Federal Reserve data on food prices during stagflation, families desperately needed ways to stretch expensive ground beef into multiple satisfying meals, as meat prices had risen so dramatically that traditional portions were beyond most budgets. The homemade concept solved this by combining small amounts of meat with pasta, rice, or potatoes, plus seasonings and vegetables to create substantial meals. The basic version used ingredients most families could keep on hand: pasta or rice for bulk, dried onion soup, mix for flavor, and whatever vegetables could be afforded or grown in gardens. A single pound of ground beef could feed a family of 6 when combined with these extenders. Compared to the 2 or 3 people the same amount would feed traditionally. The preparation became a family activity that helped stretch not just ingredients, but time and attention during stressful periods. The one-pot cooking method also saved energy costs that were rising along with food prices. What made homemade Hamburger Helper particularly appealing was its psychological impact. Families could create the same convenient, satisfying meals they'd enjoyed during better times, maintaining normalcy and familiar comfort even as food costs spiraled beyond control. These homemade versions often tasted better than commercial products because families could adjust seasonings and add extra vegetables. Tuna Noodle Surprise. During the 1970s energy crisis that saw gas prices quadruple and food costs become unpredictable, canned tuna became one of the most reliable and affordable proteins available. According to research on stagflation-era eating habits, families created countless variations of tuna noodle casserole to provide protein-rich, satisfying meals at minimal cost, using ingredients with relatively stable prices. The basic foundation remained consistent. Egg noodles provided filling carbohydrates, canned tuna delivered protein, and cream of mushroom soup created the binding sauce. The surprise element came from families adding whatever unexpected ingredients they had available: crushed potato chips for crunch, frozen peas for color, diced celery for texture, or leftover vegetables from previous meals. What made tuna noodle casserole particularly valuable was its incredible adaptability to changing ingredient availability and prices. When certain vegetables became too expensive, families could substitute freely without compromising nutrition or satisfaction. When milk prices spiked, the cream soup could be made with water and powdered milk. The preparation was designed for efficiency and economy during the energy crisis. The entire meal could be assembled quickly and baked in one dish, minimizing preparation time and energy costs. The casserole could also be prepared in advance and reheated, crucial when energy costs were rising. The psychological comfort was enormous for families struggling with economic uncertainty. It looked and felt like traditional American comfort food, provided satisfaction of a hot, substantial dinner, and could be prepared even when fresh ingredients were unavailable or unaffordable. Poor man's Stroganoff. Traditional beef stroganoff made with expensive cuts, sour cream, and butter became impossible for most families during severe 1970s inflation when beef prices had risen so dramatically that many families couldn't afford any fresh meat. According to Federal Reserve data, food prices were rising faster than wages, forcing families to find creative alternatives using much less expensive ingredients. Poor man's Stroganoff represented the era's approach to maintaining familiar comfort foods while adapting to harsh economic realities through ingredient substitution. Instead of expensive beef cuts, the recipe used ground beef, which was cheaper but still provided protein and the satisfying meat element. Some families even substituted canned corned beef when fresh ground beef became too expensive. The key to success lay in building flavor through technique rather than expensive ingredients. The ground beef was browned thoroughly to develop deep, rich flavors, creating taste complexity that compensated for the less luxurious protein source. Onions were cooked slowly until caramelized, adding natural sweetness and depth. The sauce was crucial for creating the creamy, indulgent texture that made stroganoff psychologically satisfying. When sour cream was affordable, it provided traditional tangy richness. When too expensive, families created similar effects, using regular milk thickened with flour, with vinegar or lemon juice added for characteristic tang. What made Poor Man's Stroganoff particularly important was its psychological impact. Families could maintain the comfort and familiar flavors of a beloved dish while adapting to new economic realities, helping them feel they were still eating well despite financial constraints. Bean and Rice Power Bowl. As food prices soared during the 1970s stagflation crisis, nutritionists began actively promoting rice and bean combinations as complete proteins that could replace expensive meat while providing all essential amino acids. According to USDA guidance, this combination provided protein equivalent to expensive meat dishes while costing a fraction of animal protein. The nutritional science was sophisticated, representing a significant shift in American understanding of plant-based nutrition. Rice provided certain essential amino acids, while beans provided others, and when consumed together, they created complete protein profiles equivalent to meat, eggs, or dairy. This combination also provided complex carbohydrates, fiber, and various vitamins and minerals. Families learned to prepare large batches of seasoned rice and beans that could be served multiple ways throughout the week. The basic preparation included sautéing onions and garlic in whatever oil was available, adding rice and cooking until lightly toasted, then adding water or broth and simmering until tender. Beans were cooked separately from dried form and seasoned with available spices. The preparation became an opportunity to explore flavors from other cultures, as rice and bean combinations were staples in many international cuisines. Ramen Revolution. When instant ramen became widely available during the 1970s, it represented the ultimate convergence of convenience, economy, and basic nutrition, providing substantial calories for literally pennies per serving. According to food industry data, ramen provided more calories per dollar than almost any other available food, while requiring minimal cooking equipment and virtually no preparation skills. The basic preparation was brilliantly simple. Boil water, add noodles and seasoning packet, cook for 3 minutes. But creative cooks quickly learned to transform this ultra-basic meal into more nutritious dishes by adding whatever ingredients they could afford. College students and struggling families pioneered countless innovations that turned cheap ramen into complete meals. Common enhancements involved adding protein through eggs beaten into hot broth, canned tuna or chicken for substantial protein, or even peanut butter for protein and richness. Vegetables could be added fresh, frozen, or canned, anything from simple green onions to elaborate combinations of whatever was available. Advanced techniques involved using multiple flavor packets with single servings to create more intense flavors, or combining different ramen varieties for unique taste profiles. Some families prepared ramen dry by cooking noodles, draining them, and tossing with seasoning packets plus oil or butter. What made ramen particularly valuable during economic crisis was its incredible shelf stability and minimal storage requirements. Families could stock up when money was available and always have quick, hot meals ready. The long shelf life meant food security could be maintained even when income was unpredictable. Dollar Store Gourmet. During the catastrophic 2008 financial crisis, when 8.7 million Americans lost their jobs virtually overnight, dollar stores became unexpected sources for complete meal ingredients. According to Federal Reserve data, middle-income families saw their food spending drop by 12.5%, forcing them to shop at discount retailers they had never considered and learn cooking techniques they had never needed. Creating satisfying, nutritious meals using only dollar store ingredients required creativity, knowledge, and determination that many families had to develop quickly under desperate circumstances. Basic ingredients like canned vegetables, pasta, rice, seasonings, processed meats, and simple condiments had to be combined skillfully to create meals that provided adequate nutrition while maintaining family morale. Families learned to create complex flavors using simple seasonings and techniques. Canned tomatoes became pasta sauce foundations when combined with garlic powder, dried herbs, and careful cooking that concentrated flavors. Canned chicken or tuna could be stretched into multiple meals by combining with pasta, rice, or vegetables in casserole form. The shopping strategy required new skills and knowledge. Families had to learn which dollar store brands provided the best nutrition and value, how to combine shelf-stable ingredients into complete meals, and how to create meal plans that maximized nutrition and satisfaction from limited ingredients. What made dollar store cooking particularly poignant was the dramatic lifestyle adjustment it represented. Many had been middle class just months earlier, eating at restaurants and buying premium groceries without considering cost. The transition represented not just economic necessity, but profound changes in identity and daily life. Foreclosure food. As nearly 10 million American families faced foreclosure during the 2008 crisis, those preparing to lose their homes had to develop entirely new approaches to food that prioritized portability, non-perishability, and minimal preparation requirements. According to research on the crisis's impact, families facing housing instability developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining nutrition while preparing for complete disruption of their living situations. These meals focused primarily on shelf-stable, portable foods that could be prepared with minimal equipment and transported easily when families had to move quickly or live in temporary situations. Peanut butter and crackers became complete meals, providing protein, carbohydrates, and fat, while requiring no preparation or refrigeration. Canned soup could be eaten cold or heated on hot plates in hotel rooms. The meal planning process required completely different thinking than normal food preparation. Families had to consider which foods could be prepared without full kitchens, which ingredients wouldn't spoil without refrigeration, and which meals could provide adequate nutrition while being eaten under stressful circumstances. Many families developed systems for using their remaining kitchen equipment efficiently while they still had access, preparing large batches of foods that could be portioned and stored for later consumption. Soups and stews were cooked in large quantities and frozen in individual portions. Survival standouts. Everything soup across every economic crisis in American history, from the devastating unemployment of the Great Depression through the rationing of World War II, the inflation crisis of the 1970s, and the foreclosure epidemic of 2008. Families consistently return to the fundamental concept of everything soup, a meal that represented ultimate adaptability, resourcefulness, and the refusal to waste any potentially useful ingredient. The concept was beautifully simple. Start with water or any available broth as a foundation, then add whatever vegetables, grains, proteins, or seasonings were available. No two pots were ever identical, but each provided essential nutrition, warmth, and comfort that helped families survive impossible circumstances while maintaining dignity and hope. The preparation process varied dramatically based on available ingredients, but certain principles remained constant. Aromatics like onions, garlic, or celery formed the flavor foundation when available. Vegetables were added in order of cooking time, root vegetables first, then softer items, finally leafy greens. Any available protein, meat scraps, beans, eggs, or cheese, was incorporated to create more substantial results. What made everything soup remarkable was its democratic approach to ingredients. Expensive items and cheap ones combined equally, creating meals that satisfied regardless of the family's economic circumstances. Leftovers became valuable ingredients rather than waste. Scraps became flavor foundations, and creativity became the most important ingredient. Community soup kitchen style, the final forgotten meal, represents far more than just food. It embodies the community cooperation and shared resilience that sustained families through America's worst economic disasters. From Depression-era soup kitchens to modern food banks, sharing meals and resources created survival networks that no individual family could build alone. These community meals were designed for volume, nutrition, and efficiency rather than gourmet appeal. But their true value lay in the human connections they created during times when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Basic ingredients like beans, potatoes, onions, and whatever protein was available were combined in large quantities to provide adequate nutrition for whoever needed it. What made community meals special was their role in maintaining human dignity and connection during economic hardship. They proved that even in the worst circumstances, people could come together to ensure that everyone had something to eat and that no one faced hunger alone. The recipes and techniques used in community kitchens influenced home cooking as families learned new ways to prepare large quantities of food economically, stretch ingredients to feed more people, and create satisfying meals from basic ingredients. These 30 forgotten meals prove that families can survive impossible circumstances and create innovations that often surpass what prosperity provides. From mock apple pie's ingenuity to soup kitchen community spirit, each meal demonstrates the human capacity to transform scarcity into abundance through creativity and determination. These weren't just recipes, they were acts of defiance against circumstances beyond control, proof that dignity and nutrition could be maintained when everything else was lost. Their legacy reminds us that the most important ingredient in any survival meal isn't what's in the pot. It's the determination to keep cooking, keep feeding your family, and keep hope alive.